For 20 winters, the silence has been my closest companion. Out here in the jagged teeth of the Montana Rockies, silence isn't an absence of sound, it's a presence. It's the whisper of wind through pine needles, the soft crunch of my boots on snow that's lain undisturbed for weeks, the distant howl of a lone wolf calling to a frozen moon. I've learned its language, its rhythms. It's a language of survival, of solitude. A language I chose over the cacophony of a world I no longer belong to. My name is Eli, and this cabin, this fortress of logs and stones I built with my own hands, is the only home I've known for 2 decades. The world remembers me as someone else, a man with a different name, a different life, a life with laughter, with love, with a future that stretched out like a sunlit highway. But a single night of screaming tires and shattered glass turned that highway into a dead end. I buried that man along with my wife and daughter. The tattoos that snake up my arms, faded ink telling stories of a life before, are the only eulogy they ever got. Out here, memories have sharp edges, but the vast indifferent wilderness helps to dull them. The cold is a constant, biting reminder that feeling anything too deeply is a liability. So I don't. I chop wood, I hunt, I track the seasons and I survive. It's a simple, brutal existence, and it's mine. This morning was like any other. The air was so cold it felt like swallowing razors. A fresh blanket of snow had fallen overnight, smoothing over the harsh landscape and muffling the world in a sheath of white. I'd just finished my morning ritual, stoking the fire in the wood stove until it roared to life, melting snow for coffee and checking my perimeter traps. The sun was a pale, hesitant disk, struggling to burn through the heavy grey clouds. It was a day for staying inside, for mending a torn buckskin jacket, for being utterly, completely alone. And I was content with that. Contentment for me wasn't happiness. It was the absence of pain, a quiet truce with my ghosts. I was standing by the single window, watching the snow begin to fall again, when I saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. Not an animal. I know the way a deer moves, the lumbering gait of a bear waking too early from hibernation. This was different. Stumbling, desperate, a figure, dark against the blinding white, fighting through the knee-deep powder. My hand instinctively went to the hunting knife on my belt. No one comes up this high. No one knows I'm here. In 20 years I haven't had a single visitor. My solitude was a wall, and someone was about to crash against it. The figure drew closer, and my breath caught in my chest. It was a woman. Her coat was thin, useless against the brutal cold, her face a mask of exhaustion and terror. And then I saw the unmistakable swell of her belly. She was pregnant. She took one more agonizing step, her eyes locking on my cabin, as if it were a lighthouse in a storm, and then her legs gave out. She collapsed face down in the snow, a small, dark mound in a vast sea of white. For a long moment, I didn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt the door, to let the wilderness claim her. She was the world I'd run from, a complication I couldn't afford. Bringing her inside would be letting in chaos, emotion, the past. It would be a crack in the foundation of the life I'd so carefully constructed. I could turn away. I could pretend I hadn't seen her. The snow would cover her soon, and it would be as if she were never here. The silence would return. But as I watched, unmoving, her hand twitched, a small, desperate movement in the snow. She was fighting, and in that tiny, almost imperceptible gesture, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't seen in 20 years. Not in the world, and certainly not in myself. I saw a fight for a life other than one's own. The cold air burned my lungs as I exhaled a curse. The ghosts of my past stirred, whispering that I couldn't just stand here. I couldn't. With a guttural sigh that seemed to tear from the deepest part of my soul, I unbolted the door and stepped out into the storm. The silence was broken. The cold hit me like a physical blow as I trudged through the snow toward her. The wind whipped flakes into my face, stinging my skin. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her face, partially buried in the snow, was alarmingly pale, her lips tinged with blue. Panic, an emotion I thought I'd long since buried, coiled in my gut. I knelt, my knees sinking into the powder, and carefully rolled her over. She was younger than I first thought, maybe late 20s, with strands of dark hair plastered to her frozen cheeks. Her worn-out coat was soaked through, She wouldn't last another 10 minutes out here. Damn it, I muttered to the howling wind. This was a mistake, a catastrophic life-altering mistake. But leaving her to die felt like a different kind of damnation, one I wasn't sure I could live with. With a grunt, I scooped her into my arms. She was lighter than I expected, fragile. It felt wrong. It had been 2 decades since I'd held anyone. The feeling was alien, a phantom limb aching with a memory I'd tried to amputate. Her head lolled against my shoulder, and I carried her back to the cabin, kicking the door shut behind me with my heel. The sudden warmth of the cabin was a shock. I laid her down on the bearskin rug in front of the wood stove, the closest thing I had to a soft bed. Her body was rigid with cold. I worked quickly, my survival instincts taking over. I stripped off her wet coat, her soaked boots and socks. Her clothes underneath were thin and damp. Hesitantly, I pulled the wet sweater over her head and wrapped her in the driest, warmest wool blankets I owned. I rubbed her hands and feet, trying to force circulation back into them, my rough, calloused fingers clumsy against her cold skin. She was completely unresponsive, a stranger, a problem, lying in the heart of my sanctuary. She didn't wake for hours. I sat in my worn armchair across the room, my hunting rifle resting across my lap, watching her. Not out of concern, I told myself, but out of caution. Who was she? How did she find this place? Was she alone? Every rustle of the wind outside made me tense, my eyes scanning the tree line through the window. Part of me expected to see a man's figure emerging from the woods, a man with anger in his eyes. People who end up in this kind of trouble are usually running from something, or someone. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the peaks, casting long blue shadows across the snow, she stirred. A soft moan escaped her lips, and her eyes fluttered open. They were a deep, startling blue, and for a second they were filled with sheer terror. She tried to sit up, her movements frantic. "Easy," I said, my voice a low growl, rough from disuse. "You're safe." The word sounded foreign on my tongue. Safe. This place was safe for me because it was empty. Her presence was the most dangerous thing to happen to it in 20 years. She flinched at the sound of my voice, and scrambled backward, until her back hit the stone hearth of the fireplace. Her eyes darted around the small one-room cabin, at the rack of drying herbs, the stacked firewood, the hunting gear hanging on the walls, and finally, at me. I know what she saw, a big weathered man with a wild beard and tattoos, holding a rifle. Her fear was a tangible thing in the small space between us. Where am I?" she stammered, her voice hoarse. She instinctively wrapped her arms around her stomach, a protective gesture that sent another unwelcome pang through my chest. "My cabin," I answered flatly. "You collapsed in the snow, you would have frozen to death." She stared at me, her mind clearly racing. "Thank you," she whispered, though her body was still coiled like a spring, ready to flee. "I need to go." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Go where? There's a blizzard moving in. You can't even see 10 feet out that window. You wouldn't last an hour." I gestured with my head toward the swirling white chaos outside. "You're stuck here, at least for a few days." The color drained from her face, replaced by a desperate resolve. "I can't. He'll find me." She bit her lip, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She wouldn't say more. She didn't have to. I'd seen that look before, a lifetime ago, in the eyes of women in shelters where my wife used to volunteer. The look of someone who has been hunted. "There are no tracks but yours for miles," I said, my tone softer than I intended. "No one followed you. You're safe from him here." I stood up, and placed the rifle back on its rack by the door. It was a gesture of trust, or something close to it. "My name is Eli." She watched me for a long moment, her breath trembling slightly. "Lila," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Lila." For the next 2 days, we existed in a fragile, unspoken truce. The blizzard raged outside, trapping us together in the small cabin. The space felt like it had shrunk, charged with the energy of another human being. We barely spoke. I cooked, she ate. I tended the fire, she watched, huddled in the blankets. The silence was different now. It was no longer my companion. It was an awkward, heavy thing, filled with unspoken questions and shared anxieties. I found myself watching her when she wasn't looking. This woman who had crashed into my life like a meteorite, bringing with her a world of pain and fear that felt unnervingly familiar. She was a reminder of everything I had fled. And yet, as the storm howled, a strange unwelcome thought took root in my mind. For the first time in 20 years, I was not entirely alone in the wilderness. And I wasn't sure if that was a curse or something else entirely. The blizzard broke on the third day. The world outside was reborn, pristine and dazzling under a brilliant, cloudless sky. The sheer amount of snow was staggering. It was piled in massive drifts against the cabin, burying the lower half of my window. We were snowed in, truly and completely. The fragile peace of our silence broke with the weather. We couldn't ignore each other anymore. It started with small things. I was sharpening my hunting knife by the fire, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound in the room. Lila, who had been watching me with wary eyes from her spot on the rug, finally spoke. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice soft. I paused, my hands stilling. "What do you mean?" "Out here," she clarified, gesturing vaguely to the cabin, to the wilderness beyond the window. "Why are you alone?" The question hung in the air, heavy and direct. It was a door I had nailed shut and barricaded 20 years ago. No one had ever dared to knock. I could have shut her down, told her it was none of her business. The old Eli, the one who first built these walls, would have. But looking at her, at the genuine non-judgmental curiosity in her eyes, the usual defenses didn't seem to work. She wasn't asking to be nosy. She was asking because she too was alone. I took a slow breath and set the knife down. "I lost my family," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "A car accident. My wife Sarah, and my daughter, Maya. She was 6. I hadn't said their names aloud in almost 2 decades. Saying them now felt like both a betrayal and a relief. Lila's expression softened, the fear in her eyes replaced by a profound, heart-wrenching empathy. She didn't offer platitudes or empty apologies. She just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a shared landscape of pain. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and I knew she meant it. "After that," I continued, my voice low and gravelly, "the world, it was too loud, too full of things that reminded me of them, of what I'd lost. So I left, came up here where the only thing you have to worry about is surviving today." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Sometimes that's all you can do." Her gaze drifted to the fire, her thoughts clearly turning inward. "His name was Mark," she said, her voice barely audible. "He was charming. Everyone loved him. At first it was perfect. He made me feel like the only person in the world." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "Then the doors would close, and he'd change. It started with words, telling me I was stupid, worthless, that no one else would ever want me. Then, it got worse." She didn't need to elaborate. The faint faded bruise I'd noticed on her temple when I first brought her in told its own story. "When I found out I was pregnant, I thought it would make things better. I was so naive. It just gave him something else to control, something else to threaten." Her hand went to her belly. "One night, he told me he'd make sure this baby never drew a breath if I ever tried to leave. The next morning I packed a small bag while he was in the shower, took all the cash I had, and just ran. I didn't know where I was going, just away. I ended up on a bus, then another. I walked for what felt like days. I just wanted to find a place where he could never find me." "He won't find you here," I said, the words coming out with more force than I expected. A primal protective instinct I thought had died with my family flared to life inside me. "I'll make sure of that." Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw a flicker of trust, a tiny seed being planted in frozen ground. That conversation changed everything. The silence was no longer heavy. It became comfortable. We started talking more. I told her about the mountains, about how to read the weather in the clouds, which berries were safe to eat. She told me about her dreams of being a painter, a life she'd put on hold for a man who only wanted to tarnish her canvas. I found myself smiling, a real, genuine smile that felt like cracking ice. I taught her how to set a simple snare. She laughed when a squirrel managed to steal the bait, a sound so bright and clear it seemed to chase the shadows from the corners of the cabin. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, she got a sudden sharp pain in her side. Fear, cold and immediate, seized both of us. I helped her lie down, my mind racing through the limited medical knowledge I had. It turned out to be a Braxton Hicks contraction, a false alarm. But in that moment of shared panic, as I held a cup of water to her lips and she gripped my hand with surprising strength, something shifted permanently. The lines blurred. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She was Lila, and the tiny kicking life inside her was no longer just a complication. It was a baby, a new life getting ready to enter the world right here in my fortress of solitude. I started making things. A cradle, carved from a smooth piece of pine, its surface sanded until it felt like silk. I told myself it was practical, that the baby would need a place to sleep. But as I worked, shaping the wood, I knew it was more than that. I was building something, not a wall to keep the world out, but something to welcome it in. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't just surviving. I was preparing for a future. Our future. The thaw had begun, not just in the world outside, but deep inside me. The baby decided to come during the worst storm of the season. It wasn't a blizzard, but a ferocious, howling gale that threw ice and snow against the cabin like a battering ram. The wind shrieked through the pines with a demonic fury, and the whole structure seemed to groan under the assault. It was the middle of the night. One moment, we were asleep. The next, I was jolted awake by Lila's sharp cry of pain. I was on my feet in an instant, my heart pounding against my ribs. In the dim light from the embers in the stove, I could see her clutching her stomach, her face contorted in agony. "It's time," she gasped, her voice strained. "It's really time." A cold dread, colder than any winter night, washed over me. This was it, the one thing I was completely terrifyingly unprepared for. I was a hunter, a survivalist. I could set a broken bone, stitch a wound, track an animal for days. But this was about bringing life into the world, not just preserving it. And my only experience with childbirth was a memory wrapped in unimaginable pain, a hospital room that had ended in silence. "Okay," I said, forcing my voice to be steady, to betray none of the terror churning inside me. "Okay, Lila, just breathe." Omia. I threw more logs on the fire, plunging the cabin into a warm, flickering light. I boiled water, though I wasn't entirely sure why, other than it seemed like the thing to do. I gathered every clean blanket and cloth I had. My hands, usually so steady when skinning a deer or sighting a rifle, were trembling. The ghosts were back, whispering in the howl of the wind. The ghost of Sarah, her hand gripping mine. The ghost of a tiny perfect baby, who never got to grow up. "You failed them," the voices hissed. "You'll fail her too." "I can't do this, Eli." Lila cried out, another contraction racking her body. Her face was pale with sweat, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm so scared." I knelt beside her, taking her hand. It was slick with sweat. "Yes, you can," I said, looking directly into her eyes, forcing myself to be the rock she needed. "We can. You are the strongest person I have ever met. Lila, you escaped hell to give this baby a life. You fought this far. You can do this. We'll do it together." And in that moment, I wasn't just talking to her. I was talking to myself, to the ghosts. I was choosing now. I was choosing this life, this moment, over the all-consuming grief of the past. The hours that followed were a blur of pain, encouragement, and primal effort. The storm outside raged in a symphony with Lila's labor. I was her anchor. I coached her breathing, wiped her forehead, gave her water. I murmured words of encouragement, things I didn't know I had in me. I channeled every memory of Sarah's strength, not as a source of pain, but as a source of guidance. Between contractions, in moments of quiet exhaustion, Lila would look at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and absolute trust, a trust I felt I had done nothing to earn, but that I would die trying to honor. The world narrowed to the small space on the bearskin rug. Nothing else existed, not the storm, not the past, not the lonely years, just the two of us, fighting together. Then, just as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the window, a new sound joined the howling wind. A cry, a powerful, angry, beautiful cry. A baby, a perfect tiny girl, squirming and screaming in my hands. Tears streamed down my face, hot and unchecked. I hadn't cried in 20 years. I quickly cleaned her off, and wrapped her in the softest wool blanket, her tiny body warm and solid against my chest. I looked at Lila. She was utterly exhausted, but her face was luminous, tears of joy and relief tracing paths through the sweat on her cheeks. I carefully placed the baby in her arms. Lila looked down at her daughter, her fingers tracing the baby's tiny cheek. "She's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked up at me, her blue eyes shining. "Thank you, Eli. You saved us." I could only shake my head, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The truth was, they had saved me. As the storm finally subsided, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. It wasn't the empty silence of solitude anymore. It was a peaceful silence, filled with the soft breathing of a new mother, and the occasional gentle sigh from a newborn baby. I stood by the window, looking out at the world blanketed in fresh, untouched snow. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was a new dawn. Lila, holding her daughter, spoke my name softly. I turned. "I want to name her Hope," she said. Hope. I let the word settle over me. It was a name, but it was also a promise. A future. I looked at them, this woman, and her child, who had stumbled into my life, and shattered my fortress of solitude. They hadn't destroyed it. They had rebuilt it into something I never thought I'd have again. A home. The ghosts were silent. The long winter was finally over.